My husband called it needing space to recharge. Then he invited a mistress into our bedroom and started selling my life's work, my rare books, to pay for his vanity. He forgot one thing. I restore history for a living. I know exactly how to fix a broken legacy and erase a mistake like him. Let me tell you how it all began. The air in the foyer of the Willows was usually thick with the scent of old leather and beeswax, the comforting aroma of my restoration studio. But that night, it smelled like cheap cologne and cold betrayal. Jonathan stood by the grand mahogany staircase, looking every bit the successful investment consultant he pretended to be. He didn't look like a man about to destroy a 30-year marriage. He looked like he was about to give a keynote speech. "Linda," he started, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "this isn't about you. It's about my growth. I need space to recharge, to find the version of myself that isn't suffocated by all of this." He gestured vaguely at the walls my father had built with his own hands, the very house I had painstakingly restored with my inheritance. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a vase. In my profession, you learn that the most fragile things require the steadiest hands. I simply watched the way his eyes darted to his phone, the way his expensive Italian loafers shifted on the Persian rug. He wasn't just asking for space. He was demanding a vacancy. Before I could even process the word separation, he was handing me a pre-packed suitcase. It was my own Toomey bag, the one I used for professional conferences in London. The audacity of it, him deciding what of my life fit into a single carry-on, hit me harder than any physical blow could have. "I've already arranged a suite for you at the Fairmont for the week," he said, ushering me toward the heavy oak front door. "Take some time, Linda. Let's not make this difficult." The evening air of the California hills was crisp, biting through my silk blouse as I stepped onto the porch. I turned to say something, perhaps to remind him whose name was actually on the deed, or perhaps just to look into the eyes of the man I thought I knew, but the door was already closing. Then came the sound. Chirp, click. It was the high-pitched digital song of the Yale smart lock being reprogrammed. In an instant, the mechanical heartbeat of my home had been altered. My fingerprints, my codes, my very existence was wiped from the sensors. I stood there in the shadows of the porch, the silence of the neighborhood amplified by the frantic beating of my own heart. I didn't go to the Fairmont. I walked to my Volvo, parked at the edge of the driveway, and sat there in the dark. 5 minutes later, a sleek, white Mercedes I didn't recognize pulled into the spot I had just vacated. A young woman stepped out, her heels clicking sharply on the stone path, a sound that felt like teeth on a zipper. She didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She entered the code and walked right into my life. Through the large bay windows of the living room, I watched as the warm, amber glow of the lamps I'd carefully chosen flickered on. I saw her silhouette move past the bookshelves, her hand carelessly brushing against first editions that were older than her grandmother. Jonathan appeared behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist in the very spot where we had celebrated our silver anniversary just months ago. He looked triumphant. He looked like a man who thought he had successfully performed a hostile takeover. He forgot that a house like the Willows has a memory, and so do I. He thinks he's locked me out, but he's actually just locked himself in with a woman who doesn't know that every floorboard in that house tells a story, and I'm the only one who knows how to read them. I'm sitting here in the dark, watching my life being invaded. Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home? If you're standing with me, please hit like and let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. I need to know I'm not alone before I take my first step. The steering wheel felt like a ring of ice under my palms. The dashboard clock hummed, the only sound in the suffocating silence of my Volvo. I looked up at the silhouette of the Willows, the grand Victorian lady of Pasadena, now glowing with a light that didn't belong to me anymore. Jonathan always called it the money pit, but to me, it was an altar. It was the physical manifestation of a promise my father made to my mother when they were living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in 1948, eating canned beans, and saving every nickel from his job at the printing press. My parents were children of the Great Depression. They didn't understand the concept of credit or instant gratification. To them, a dollar earned was a drop of sweat preserved. When my father finally bought this land, he didn't hire a flashy contractor. He spent his weekends here, his hands calloused and stained with sawdust, teaching me that a foundation isn't just about concrete, it's about integrity. I remember standing right there, on the porch where that girl just walked in, holding a toolbox for my father as he explained why we used solid brass hinges instead of the cheap plated ones. "Linda," he had said, his voice as steady as the house he was building, "never settle for a facade. If it isn't beautiful where no one can see it, it isn't beautiful at all." When the inheritance came to me after they passed, Jonathan had 1,000 ideas. He wanted a glass-walled condo in Malibu, something edgy and current to impress his clients. But I saw the way his eyes lit up not at the architecture, but at the potential resale value. I chose the hard road instead. I chose to bring the Willows back to life. For 3 years, while Jonathan was networking at golf clubs, I was in overalls. I spent months stripping 10 layers of hideous lead paint from the wainscoting with a heat gun and a scraper, revealing the pristine virgin redwood underneath. I sourced hand-blown glass from a craftsman in Ohio to replace the shattered panes in the conservatory. Every splinter in my hand, every ache in my back, was a conversation with my ancestors. I wasn't just fixing a house, I was practicing stewardship. This house was built on the philosophy of the long game. It was designed to withstand earthquakes, fires, and the slow rot of time. My father used to say that a person's character is like a book's binding. If it's weak, the pages of your life will eventually scatter to the wind. I look at those windows now, and I realize Jonathan never appreciated the binding. He only liked the gold leaf on the cover. He thinks he's inherited a trophy, a backdrop for his new, younger life. He doesn't realize that every floorboard in that hallway has a specific creak, a language of its own that only I can speak. He thinks he's stolen my home, but he's only occupying a space he doesn't understand. I think of my mother's favorite Depression-era saying, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." I've spent my life making things last, fixing what's broken, and honoring the old ways. Jonathan, with his recharging and his new versions, is the ultimate throwaway commodity. He's the cheap, plated hinge that snaps the moment the wind picks up. As I watch the shadows move behind my bedroom curtains, I'm not just sad, I'm insulted. He is bringing a plastic soul into a sanctuary of solid oak. But the thing about solid oak is that it doesn't yield easily. It takes a lot of pressure to break it, and even more to burn it down. I pulled up the security app on my phone, the blue light reflecting in my glasses like a ghostly interrogation. I had installed these cameras to protect my rare manuscripts and the fragile history within these walls, never dreaming I'd be using them to witness the ransacking of my own soul. Through the grainy, wide-angle lens of the living room feed, I watched Isabella, a girl who looked like she was made of filters and fast fashion, twirl through my sanctuary. She wasn't just a guest, she was an invasive species. My heart constricted as I saw her reach for the mantle. She picked up a hand-thrown ceramic vase, a piece my mother had cherished, a relic of a local artisan from the 1950s. To the untrained eye, it was just clay. To me, it was the vessel that had held every birthday bouquet of my life. I watched, breathless, as she made a face, whispered something to Jonathan, and then placed it, unceremoniously, into a heavy-duty trash bag she had dragged into the center of the room. In its place, she set down a garish, gold-plated love sign she must have picked up from a clearance bin. It was like watching a masterpiece being painted over with neon graffiti. She continued her purge, tossing my hand-embroidered throw pillows aside to make room for tacky, sequined cushions that looked like they belonged in a cheap nightclub, not a Victorian estate. But the real knife to the chest came when the camera feed switched to the primary bedroom. My bedroom. I saw her sit at my vanity, the one I had restored myself, stripping away years of grime to find the bird's eye maple underneath. She didn't respect the wood. She slammed her acrylic nails onto the surface and began Davidoff spraying a cloud of some sickly sweet synthetic perfume that I knew would linger in the curtains for weeks. Then she opened my jewelry box. She didn't steal, not yet. She just mocked. She held up my grandmother's pearls, laughing as she draped them over her sweatshirt, shaking her head as if they were some dusty, ancient burden. Jonathan stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a glass of scotch, watching her with a terrifyingly blank smile. He wasn't stopping her. He was enjoying the erasure of me. Every time she touched something I loved, it felt like a physical bruise. I watched her pull my silk robe from the hook, the one I bought in Florence after finishing a 6-month restoration of a 14th century hymnal, and wrap it around her shoulders. She looked at herself in my mirror, pouting her lips for a selfie, completely unaware that she was a caricature standing in a temple. The contrast was nauseating, the enduring weight of the willows versus the absolute, shimmering emptiness of the woman now occupying it. Jonathan thinks he's traded old and tired for new and exciting. He doesn't realize that he's just replaced a diamond with a piece of broken glass that's eventually going to cut him. I sat there in the dark of my Volvo, my thumb hovering over the record button on the app. My father always told me to watch the enemy long enough, and they'll show you exactly how they intend to fall. Isabella thinks she's modernizing my home. Jonathan thinks he's rebranding his life. They are both so blinded by their own vanity that they haven't noticed the one thing a professional restorer never misses: the structural cracks they are creating in their own foundation. I'm not just a victim watching a screen. I'm a witness gathering evidence of a sacrilege. And in the world of history, sacrilege is always followed by a very expensive penance. My eyes remained glued to the smartphone screen, but I switched the feed to the West Wing, my library. This room was the heart of the Willows, a climate-controlled sanctuary where the air stayed at a precise 68 degrees and the scent of ancient vellum acted as my meditation. This was where I spent my days, meticulously reattaching detached spines and cleaning foxing from pages that had survived wars and revolutions. Jonathan usually avoided this room. He said it smelled like stagnation. But tonight, he wasn't avoiding it. He was moving through it with a predatory energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I watched through the high-definition lens as he set up a professional-grade ring light, the kind Isabella probably used for her social media videos, right in the center of my workspace. He wasn't alone. He was barking orders at a young man I didn't recognize, someone who looked like he worked for a high-end estate liquidation firm. "Make sure you get the gilt edges on the 1850 edition," Jonathan said, his voice echoing through the speakers of my phone with a sickening clarity. "And the signature on the frontispiece of the Poe collection. That's the big-ticket item. We need these listed by Monday." My heart didn't just ache. It felt like it was being fed through a paper shredder. Those books weren't just items. They were patients I had healed. The Poe collection had come to me as a moldering pile of damp paper, and I had spent 4 months of my life, cell by cell, bringing it back from the brink of total loss. The stranger began handling my books with a callousness that made me want to scream. He didn't use gloves. He didn't support the boards correctly as he forced the antique bindings open to photograph the title pages. I saw the spine of a rare Kelmscott Press edition groan under the pressure of his thumb, a sound I could almost feel in my own bones. Jonathan stood back, sipping his scotch, checking his own reflection in the glass of the bookshelves. "We need to move the entire lot quickly," he told the man. "Discreetly. Private collectors only. My wife is out of town, and I want this handled before the divorce papers are finalized." Divorce. He finally said the word. But it wasn't the legal termination of a marriage that stung. It was the theft of a legacy. This wasn't just about space to recharge. Jonathan was drowning. I knew his consulting business had been quiet lately, but I hadn't realized he was this desperate. He was looking at my life's work as a liquid asset, a way to fund his midlife crisis and Isabella's designer handbags. He thought he could strip the house of its soul while I was sitting in a hotel room crying into a pillow. He thought my silence over the years, my quiet dedication to my craft, was a sign of a woman who wouldn't fight back. I watched him pick up my father's favorite ledger, a simple leather-bound book from the Great Depression, where my father had recorded every cent he earned and spent. Jonathan tossed it aside onto the not valuable pile, like it was trash. He didn't understand that the value of things isn't just in their market price, but in the grit it took to keep them. As he moved toward the safe where I kept the truly priceless incunabula, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me. The shock was gone. The hurt was being replaced by a structural, engineered resolve. Jonathan wants to play with the big-ticket items? Fine. He wants to talk about assets? We'll talk about assets. But he's forgotten one crucial rule of my profession. Before you can restore something, you have to identify the rot. And Jonathan, I've just found the source. I opened my laptop, the screen's clinical white light washing over the interior of my Volvo like a spotlight on a crime scene. Jonathan always mocked my meticulous record-keeping, calling my spreadsheets the hobby of a stagnant mind. He preferred the dynamic energy of day trading apps that flashed neon green and red, looking more like a casino floor than a financial strategy. But as a restorer, I know that if you want to find the truth, you don't look at the bright colors on the surface. You look at the ledger hidden in the binding. For the next hour, while the man I thought I knew was busy playing Lord of the Manor on my security feed, I became a forensic accountant of my own tragedy. The rot was deeper than I ever imagined. Jonathan hadn't just been unlucky with a few investments. He had been hemorrhaging our life's blood for years. I navigated through our joint accounts, watching the trail of digital breadcrumbs lead straight to the dark corners of his vanity. There were consulting fees paid to shell companies that shared an address with offshore gambling sites. There were 5-figure wire transfers to luxury concierge services in Las Vegas, dated the same weekends he told me he was attending historical preservation seminars in Scottsdale. He wasn't an investment consultant. He was a professional ghost, haunting our bank accounts and leaving nothing but vapor in his wake. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the credit card statements. Isabella's lifestyle wasn't funded by her modeling. It was funded by the interest on our home equity line. Every designer bag she flaunted, every overpriced martini they shared, was a brick pulled from the foundation of the Willows. Then, I found the ticking clock. It was a series of frantic emails in his deleted folder from a private lending firm, the kind of people who don't care about your credit score because they know how to collect in other ways. Jonathan owed them a sum that made my breath hitch. They were threatening to move against his assets by the end of the month. That was why he needed me out tonight. That was why he had the estate liquidator in my library. He wasn't just finding himself. He was trying to sell my skin to save his own. He looked at my collection of rare books, works of art that had survived centuries, and saw nothing but a pile of cash to throw into the furnace of his debts. The most insulting part wasn't the theft. It was his sheer, arrogant sloppiness. He thought because I spent my days with dust and vellum, I wouldn't understand the digital world. He thought he could delete his tracks and I'd be too emotional to look for them. He underestimated the patience of a woman who can spend 10 hours with a magnifying glass and a scalpel just to remove a single ink stain. As I downloaded the files onto an encrypted drive, I felt a strange sense of calm. The man in that house was a fraud, a hollowed-out shell of a human being held together by expensive tailoring and lies. He had been treating our marriage like a leveraged buyout, but he'd made a fatal error. He didn't realize that I held the majority share. I closed my laptop and looked back at the house. The lights were still on, but the power had already shifted. Jonathan thinks he's a shark, but he's just a paper tiger. And I know exactly how easily paper burns. I didn't drive to the Fairmont. I didn't go to a friend's house to cry. Instead, I drove to a quiet, tree-lined street in downtown Pasadena, where the streetlights filtered through the ancient oaks like spotlights on a stage. I stopped in front of a modest two-story brick building that housed the office of Arthur Vance. Arthur wasn't just a lawyer. He was the man who had handled my father's estate, the man who had watched me grow from a girl with dusty hands into a woman who preserved history. He was the old guard, a man who still believed that a person's word was their bond and that a contract was sacred. When I buzzed the night entrance, Arthur opened the door himself. He was in his late 70s, wearing a cardigan that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He didn't ask why I was there at midnight with a suitcase and a look of cold fire in my eyes. He just stepped aside and pointed toward the leather armchair in his study. "I saw the movement in the trust accounts earlier today, Linda," he said softly, his voice a low rumble of disappointment. "I was hoping you'd call." I sat down and placed my laptop and the encrypted drive on his desk. "He's in the house, Arthur. He brought a girl in. He's already started tagging my books for an estate sale. He's trying to liquidate the library to pay off creditors I didn't even know existed until 2 hours ago." I felt a tremor in my voice, but I suppressed it. In my studio, if you let your hand shake, you ruin the page. I couldn't afford to ruin this page. Arthur leaned back, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. "Jonathan always was a man who preferred the shimmer to the substance," he sighed. "He thinks he can sell those books because he thinks they are marital property. He thinks the house is an asset he can leverage. He's forgotten the American dream your father actually built. Your father didn't just build a house, Linda. He built a fortress." He reached into a heavy steel filing cabinet and pulled out a thick, cream-colored folder bound with a silk ribbon, the kind of document that felt heavy with the weight of permanence. "The irrevocable trust," Arthur said, tapping the cover. "Your father was a survivor of the Great Depression. He didn't trust the whims of the market, and he certainly didn't trust the men you might choose to marry. He placed the Willows and the entirety of your professional collection into this trust. You are the sole beneficiary and the sole trustee. These assets do not belong to you, they belong to the trust. Therefore, they are not and have never been marital property. Jonathan can't sell a single page of those books because, legally, he doesn't even have the right to sit on the sofa without your permission." A dark, intellectual satisfaction began to bloom in my chest. All those years, Jonathan had mocked my obsession with the past, never realizing that the past was the very thing that was going to bury him. Arthur began scrolling through the digital evidence I had gathered, the gambling debts, the wire transfers, the secret consulting fees. "You've been very thorough, Linda," he noted, a professional glint in his eye. "This isn't just a divorce anymore. This is a forensic dissection. But we need one more thing to close the trap. We need to see what he told the lenders." Arthur leaned into the glow of his dual monitors, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with a speed that defied his age. "If Jonathan was truly desperate enough to bring in an estate liquidator, he's likely already tried to pull equity out of the house," he muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence of the office was punctuated only by the hum of the air conditioner and the steady, rhythmic clicking of the mouse. Suddenly, he paused. "Here it is, a filing from 3 weeks ago. A private mortgage application for $500,000 against the Willows." I felt the blood drain from my face, not out of fear, but out of a cold, analytical disgust. I leaned over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the digital document. As a restorer, I'm trained to see things others miss, the microscopic difference between an original pigment and a modern imitation, the slight variation in a pen's pressure. When I reached the final page of the application, I saw it, my signature. It was elegant, flowing, and utterly fraudulent. To a bank teller, it might have looked perfect. To me, it was a mess. "He's a fool," I whispered, my voice sounding like dry parchment. "He used a ballpoint pen with too much drag. My L always has a slight feathering because I only ever use a fountain pen with a medium soft nib. And the slant, it's 5 degrees too upright. He was nervous when he did this. He was shaking." Arthur looked up at me, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's not just a bad imitation, Linda. It's a felony. In the state of California, forging a signature on a deed of trust or a mortgage application is a serious crime. But more importantly, he tried to pledge an asset he doesn't own. The bank hasn't funded the loan yet because they were still waiting on the final trust verification. He was trying to beat the clock, hoping the money would hit his account before I noticed the discrepancy. I looked at the screen, at the pixelated image of my stolen name, and I realized that Jonathan hadn't just ended our marriage. He had declared war on my father's legacy. He thought he was playing a game of chess with a librarian, never realizing that he was actually dealing with a woman who spent her life rebuilding what others had tried to destroy. The pieces were finally all on the board. The gambling debts, the mistress in my bed, the attempted sale of my rare books, and now, the forgery. Jonathan's arrogance had become his blindfold. He was so convinced of his own charm and my perceived weakness that he hadn't even bothered to cover his tracks properly. He thought my silence over the years was a white flag. He didn't realize it was a scout's report. Arthur closed the file and looked at me with a profound professional respect. "He's handed us the rope, Linda. All we have to do is let him tie the knot." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in my skirt, feeling a surge of power that was more intoxicating than any wine. The Willows was calling me back, not as a victim, but as the master of the house. He thought my silence was weakness, but I was just gathering the rope for him to hang his own reputation. He even dared to forge my name on a mortgage application for the house my father paid for in cash. What would you do if you found out your partner was stealing your very legacy? Should I show him mercy, or let the law crush him? Type truth in the comments if you think he deserves no pity, and don't forget to like this video to support justice for me. 2 days later, I returned to the Willows. I didn't rush. A restorer knows that haste is the enemy of precision. I had spent 48 hours in a quiet hotel suite, not mourning, but preparing every stitch of the trap. As I pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to set over the Pasadena hills, casting long, judgmental shadows across the lawn. The first thing that hit me wasn't a sight, but a sound. The thumping, mindless bass of house music leaking through the thick oak doors of my home. It was a rhythmic violation of the peace I had spent decades cultivating. I walked toward the French doors of the dining room, the very room where my parents had celebrated their 50th anniversary, with nothing but a home-cooked meal and a bottle of decent cider. Through the glass, I saw a scene that would have made my mother weep. The table, the solid cherrywood table I had polished by hand until it shone like a dark mirror, was covered in greasy pizza boxes and half-empty plastic containers. But it was what Jonathan was holding that made my blood run cold. He was gripping a 1920s Baccarat crystal glass, a piece of my grandmother's wedding set, using it to swig a neon blue energy drink mixed with cheap vodka. Beside him, Isabella was draped over one of my Louis XIV chairs, her spiked heels digging into the delicate silk upholstery I'd had imported from Lyons. She was wearing my vintage Chanel scarf, a gift from a client whose family Bible I had saved, as a tacky headband. Her loud, artificial laughter pierced through the air like a siren. They looked like toddlers playing dress-up in a museum they didn't have the soul to understand. Jonathan was regaling 2 of his equally vapid associates with tales of his upcoming international ventures, waving the priceless crystal around as if it were a disposable solo cup. The air inside, when I finally pushed the doors open, was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and a perfume so synthetic it made my eyes water. Jonathan didn't even have the grace to look startled. He looked up, his face flushed with alcohol and the unearned triumph of a man who thinks he's pulled off the heist of the century. "Linda, back so soon?" he called out, his voice slurred and dripping with a condescension that set my teeth on edge. "I told you, the Fairmont is your new home. We're just clearing out the clutter here, making room for a little more life, a little more energy." He gestured toward Isabella, who gave me a smirk that was meant to be pitying but only came across as pathetic. She was sipping from another one of my crystal glasses, leaving a thick, greasy lipstick stain on the rim that looked like a jagged wound on the glass. I stood there, motionless, my eyes fixed on the heirloom in her hand. "You're using the Baccarat for that swill?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the music like a razor through silk. Jonathan laughed, a harsh, grating sound that lacked any real joy. It's just glass, Linda. Everything in this house is just stuff. And since I'm the one managing the assets now, I suggest you get used to the new management style. He took another swig and slammed the glass down on the unprotected cherry wood, leaving a white, cloudy ring of moisture on the finish. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't fear. It was the cold, electric thrill of the hunt. He thought he was the king of the castle, but he had no idea that the walls were already closing in. He had invited his little world to watch his coronation, but all they were about to witness was his public dismantling. I checked my watch. 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, the music would stop, and the real performance would begin. The heavy bass of the music suddenly died, replaced by the sharp, authoritative rapping of knuckles on the front door. Not a guest's polite tap, but the rhythmic strike of someone who didn't plan on waiting. Jonathan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his drunken bravado. "Looks like more fans have arrived," he joked to his associates, staggering toward the foyer. "I told you, Isabella, the new energy is infectious." He threw the door wide, expecting another admirer of his fake success. Instead, the warm California evening air rushed in, accompanied by the cold, steel-gray presence of Arthur Vance and 2 uniformed officers from the Pasadena Police Department. The silence that followed was deafening. The associates froze, drinks in midair, while Isabella stood up from my Louis XIV chair, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Arthur stepped into the foyer without waiting for an invitation, his briefcase a weapon of war. "Jonathan Foster," Arthur's voice boomed, vibrating with the weight of 40 years of legal practice. "I am here as the legal representative for the Linda Kelly Irrevocable Trust. You are currently trespassing on private property." Jonathan let out a forced, high-pitched laugh, clutching his baccarat glass as if it were a shield. "Trespassing? Arthur, you old fossil, you've lost it. This is my house. I'm the man of the manor, remember? Linda, tell your little lawyer to go home before I sue him for harassment." I stepped forward into the light of the chandelier, my shadow stretching long across the stained cherry wood floor. "The house doesn't belong to you, Jonathan," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "And it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to a trust established by my father, a trust that you have no legal standing in. You aren't managing assets. You are occupying a fortress that was never yours to claim." Arthur opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, handing them to the lead officer. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, his eyes locked on Jonathan's paling face, "we have evidence of a $500,000 mortgage application filed in Mrs. Kelly's name, an application that carries a forged signature. The bank has already flagged the transaction as fraudulent." The glass in Jonathan's hand began to tremble, the blue liquid sloshing over the rim and onto his expensive shirt. The word forgery seemed to hang in the air like a guillotine. One of the officers stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Sir, we have a court-ordered injunction. You are to vacate these premises immediately and restore all digital access to the property owner. If you refuse, or if any of the trust's assets, including the book collection in the West Wing, are found to be missing or damaged, you will be taken into custody for grand theft and felony fraud." Jonathan's gaze snapped to Isabella, looking for support, but he found none. She was already backing away toward the stairs, her face stripped of its vanity, replaced by the raw, ugly realization that the millionaire she'd hooked was a hollow man standing in a borrowed house. The associates were already slipping out the side door, leaving their drinks behind like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The triumph Jonathan had felt only minutes ago had evaporated, leaving him small, trembling, and exposed under the harsh light of his own making. He looked at me, his mouth agape, finally seeing the woman I was, the restorer who knew exactly which parts of his life were fake and exactly how to remove them. Isabella didn't wait for a formal invitation to leave. The moment the word felony left the officer's mouth, the glamorous facade she had worn like a second skin dissolved, revealing the frantic, calculating opportunist underneath. She didn't look at Jonathan with love or even concern. She looked at him with the pure, unadulterated disgust one reserves for a bill that's just bounced. "A trust?" she hissed, her voice rising to a shrill, unpleasant pitch that echoed off the high ceilings. "You told me this was your family estate. You told me you were liquidating assets for our move to Cabo." She scrambled toward the stairs, her heels clattering like panicked heartbeats. I watched from the base of the staircase as she emerged minutes later, dragging 2 oversized suitcases, my suitcases, stuffed so full that the zippers were screaming. She had stripped the vanity of my high-end creams and had the audacity to be draped in my grandmother's pashmina. "Drop the bags, miss," the lead officer said, his voice a low, immovable wall of authority. Isabella froze, her face turning a blotchy, unattractive red. "Those aren't hers," I said calmly, stepping forward. "The luggage, the pashmina, and I suspect half of what's inside those bags belong to the trust. I'm happy to let the officers inventory them right here in the foyer." The humiliation was palpable. In front of the police, Arthur, and the lingering, wide-eyed gaze of the last departing associate, Isabella had to pop the latches. Out tumbled my silk slips, my professional equipment, and even a set of silver spoons she'd wrapped in a t-shirt. She looked less like a high-fashion model and more like a common thief caught in a spotlight. "Keep the t-shirt," I said, my voice dripping with a cold, clinical pity. "But leave the history. You wouldn't know what to do with it anyway." With a snarl, she grabbed her own plastic-looking designer tote, abandoned the heavy suitcases, and fled through the front door, her cheap perfume trailing behind her like a bad memory. Jonathan stood in the center of the living room, a statue of ruined ambition. The neon blue drink he had been flaunting was now just a stain on his white cuff, a mark of his sloppiness that he couldn't rub away. Arthur stepped forward, pulling a final set of papers from his briefcase with the grace of a matador delivering the final blow. "These are your copies of the injunction and a formal summons for the forgery investigation, Jonathan. You have 10 minutes to gather your personal clothing, only your clothing, and exit the property. The locks are being reset as we speak." Jonathan looked around the room, his eyes landing on the pizza boxes, the stained wood, and finally on me. He looked for a spark of the soft wife he thought he could manipulate, but he found only the iron-willed restorer. He realized then that he wasn't just losing a house, he was being erased from a masterpiece he had tried to vandalize. He walked out into the night with nothing but a gym bag and the heavy, silent weight of impending handcuffs, leaving the Willows to the only person who truly knew how to cherish its silence. The silence that followed the slamming of the front door was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 25 years. It wasn't the empty silence of loneliness. It was the sacred quiet of a cathedral after a storm has passed. I stood in the foyer of the Willows, watching the dust motes dance in the moonlight that filtered through the transoms. The air was still tainted by that synthetic perfume and the sour smell of Jonathan's desperation, but I knew exactly how to treat an environmental contaminant. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of chilled water, and picked up the phone. By 8 a.m. the next morning, a professional, white-glove restoration cleaning crew was at my door. They didn't just bring mops, they brought air scrubbers and ozone machines. I walked the supervisor through the house with the clinical detachment of a museum curator. "Everything in the primary bedroom," I said, gesturing toward the custom-carved mahogany bed frame and the luxury mattress. "I want the linens burned. I want the mattress and the pillows removed and replaced. Call the local women's shelter. Tell them I'm donating a high-end bedroom set, professionally sanitized, for their transitional housing wing. I want every surface Isabella touched scrubbed with pH-neutral cleansers until the very molecules of her presence are gone." I watched them haul the mattress out, the one Jonathan thought he had reclaimed for his new life, and felt a profound sense of lightness. I wasn't being petty. I was being thorough. In my world, you cannot restore a page until you've neutralized the acid that's eating it. By noon, the house began to breathe again. The scent of lavender and citrus replaced the cheap cologne. I spent the afternoon in my library, the West Wing, where the real heart of the Willows lived. I sat at my workbench, the familiar weight of my bone folder in my hand, and looked at the Kelmscott Press edition Jonathan had nearly destroyed. I began the slow, meditative process of realigning the fibers of the spine. Outside, the California sun began to dip behind the oaks, casting a golden amber glow over the room, the kind of light that makes old gold leaf shimmer with a life of its own. My father's ledger sat on the corner of the desk, rescued from the not valuable pile. I ran my fingers over its rugged cover. He had built this for me, not just the house, but the strength to hold it. Jonathan called once from a burner phone, his voice stripped of all its polish, sounding small and frightened as he asked about his share of the furniture. I didn't let him finish. "Jonathan," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, "you said you wanted to find yourself. You said you needed space to recharge. Well, you have all the space in the world now. I hope you find exactly who you are out there, because in this house, there isn't a single trace of you left. Not a thumbprint, not a shadow, not a memory. You aren't a chapter in my book anymore. You're just a footnote I've chosen to delete." I hung up and blocked the number. The Willows is quiet now, filled only with the scent of old paper and the peace of justice served. My home is no longer a crime scene. It's a sanctuary once again. My father always told me that a legacy isn't something you're given. It's something you protect. I've spent my life saving the words of others, but today, I finally saved my own story. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Do you think I was too harsh? Or was it the right move to burn those bridges to save my legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Until next time, stay strong and keep your legacy safe.